For historical context and more information, see the description below.
In that 14th chapter of the Gospel according to Matthew is one of the most remarkable stories of the New Testament. It comes directly after the feeding of the 5,000. Jesus had constrained his disciples to take to their boat while he dismissed the multitude. But a strong wind had come up and it tossed the little boat to and fro. It says that Jesus walked upon the sea toward them, and when the disciples saw him, they thought it was a spirit and cried out from fear. This story, of course, is related in other parts of the New Testament, but the other writers seem to be satisfied to leave it as being complete in itself. Matthew is the only one who adds to it. According to him, when Jesus said, "Be of good cheer, it is I, be not afraid," Peter answered him and said, "Lord, if it's really you, bid me to come to meet you." And Jesus told him to come, and Peter tried to do just that. But when he saw the wind boisterous, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried, saying, "Lord, save me." And immediately Jesus stretched forth his hand and caught him. Now, commentators have had a field day with this portion of Scripture. Some have said that we should accept it just as it is. They say that we should not in these days have any credibility gaps so far as miracles are concerned, that we're living in an age of miracles. What about moving a heart from one person to another? What about extrasensory perception? What might they have thought back in New Testament days if we had told them that the time was going to come when man could walk in space? Just accept the miracles, they say, and don't muddy the water by attempting to analyze every little bit of it. Others say that this was really a resurrection appearance, and through some mismanagement or other, it found itself into the wrong portion of the gospel. Others, especially the rationalists of the last century and the first portion of this, have said that Jesus really just walked by the edge of the lake, because the Greek word for upon may be translated as by. The man in the boat merely thought that he was walking on the sea. So one can spend a great deal of time tossing around in his mind just what did happen regarding this walking on the sea, but personally I have no time for it. I don't think it's significant. Certainly, if we believe that there is a God who created heaven and earth, if he wants to make a man walk on the sea, he can do it. But there's very little that we have gained for our souls if we establish that within ourselves. And I don't think the time is ever going to come when we really know what did happen. But I'm interested in some of the other things that are suggested by this story. Some of the other things in relation to Peter, how they may relate to me, how they may relate to all of us. In the first place, Peter got into trouble in the sea that night because he was the kind of person who always did his thinking after he made his move. And that can end in tragedy. He was such an impulsive person. One occasion, you remember, Jesus stood on the shore and he asked if they had caught anything. The other disciples said, "It is the Lord." Peter didn't even wait to speak. He just jumped into the water to go over to see him and to greet him. Another occasion, Christ accurately thought that he was. And the other disciples immediately began to relate some of the things that they had heard as they went about in the ministry. That some had said he was John the Baptist and some he was Elijah. But Peter just blurts out, "Thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God." It was that same impulsive nature of Peter that led him, just after he had said that this was the Lord, to stand before the accusers and to say, "I tell you, I never knew him." Incredible that any person could be so enthusiastic in his support at one moment and then could let down so in the other. He never seemed to think a moment in front of him. How he ever came to be the first bishop of the church, one would never know. Probably those of us who are allergic to bishops say, "We told you so." But Pope Leo X, he refused, to give a commission to Leonardo da Vinci to do a painting because he said, "This man will never get anything done. He's always thinking of the end before he begins." Now, Peter would be on great terms with that Pope because he just never did any thinking of the end, it seems, before he had begun. He would decide quickly in a course, but before he had given any thought to the problem, then when the problem made its appearance, he was so confused and flustered. He looks at this girl and says that he had never known them. He stands at another place by the fire and it says it was cold. Of course it was cold. Not only cold outside, but cold inwardly. It's always cold for the person who spiritually makes his move and then has to do his thinking afterwards. And poor Peter, this was his problem. His difficulty was, you see, that somehow or other he never got to the place where he strengthened himself inwardly so that he might stand outward strain. I read a sermon one time, I forget who preached it, on the matter of every time that you lengthen the ropes, you should be strengthening the stakes. And how true it is of life. We go along strengthening these ropes and giving ourselves a little more freedom all the time, but we forget to strengthen the inward stakes that will hold them. A few weeks ago, I talked with a woman who had suffered the loss of her husband. And she said, the thing that has helped me more than anything else was an illustration that was given in a sermon one day to the effect that this man, in his illness, said that he had thatched his roof in good weather. When the days were good, when things were going well, those were the days that he used to patch up his roof, and when the rain came, he was ready for it. So she said, I have certain passages in my Bible all marked and ready. I even have marked down certain paragraphs of novels that I have read because I knew this was coming 2 years ago. She said the doctor told me that he had a limited time. But she had thatched her roof in the fine weather, and she was ready for what was to come. In this story from which we've taken our text, we find then that poor Peter makes his jump, no thatching of a roof, and his faith falters as he feels the wind. It's an important business to have the foresight to do some thatching of one's roof. And I suppose this is especially true of our young people in this day. Young people today, are the free men of history. When was it in history that really is much consideration has been given to the thoughts of young people? It's true that when you look into the academic world, way back in the origins of universities, it was a kind of inner community within itself, and it was a kind of law unto itself. But certainly there never was as strong a movement as there is today to make sure that students get a hearing. They are asked to come in, give their witness before boards. Their opinion is asked in the choice of professors and in the choice of presidents of universities and of seminaries. Young people today are the free men of history. But you see, this brings a tremendous responsibility to them. And some of them have not realized this. You put a small tree out in a park, and you put an iron fence around it. And this young tree resents the fact that there is a fence placed around it, and it complains and complains, and it wants more freedom, and finally the fence is taken away. And the tree has its freedom. But it discovers with that fence away, really the only strength that it has is the strength to fall over when the first wind blows. That's their freedom. And it's going to be true until that young tree recognizes that it cannot stand up under the ravages of these days unless it puts its roots down a little further and more firmly into the ground. Young people today are the free men of history. But before God, if they're going to stand up to this new responsibility, they would better strengthen their stakes, and they would better shove their roots a little further down into the ground if they're going to stand. Peter didn't have it, and so he faltered and he cried, "Lord, save me." There's a further point in this, and I think it's a rather significant one. Peter faltered and failed because he had neglected his strong points. Do you hear that? He faltered and he failed because he had neglected his strong points. When you look back upon him, you say this was a man of enthusiasm, this was a man of vigor, this was a man of unrestrained responses. Basically, he was that. And basically, we like that kind of person, don't we? These are virtues. Enthusiasm. This ability to respond quickly and with vigor. You know where you stand with that kind of man. Where would the church be without that kind? Where would it be without the people with the virtues of a Simon Peter? I like the way James Stewart once put it. He said, "I suppose Mary should really not have shattered her lovely, precious alabaster box at Jesus' feet. And the four men with the paralytic friend should not have torn up the roof of the house to get to Jesus when they found all the doorways blocked. Matthew should not have left his ledgers and his comfortable income to go off after the prophet of Nazareth. Father Damien should not have exposed himself to leprosy. Albert Schweitzer should not have buried himself in Central Africa. And yet Dr. Stewart said, take heed that you despise not one of these, for of such is the kingdom made." A truth. Where would we be in the church without these people who, when they see the challenge, when they hear the invitation of Christ, they'll jump out into the sea and obey? They just haven't time to rationalize and to reason. They have to be on the move. Peter belonged to that. And Christ wants that kind of person. And so he said, come. Great virtue, see. If they're not allowed to lie fallow, if they're not allowed just to stay under the tree and then they drop off and they decay, he failed to support what was strongest in him. He failed to give nourishment to what God had given as his great virtue. God, placed us in a world where all of us have some places where we're stronger than others, and yet not a one of us does he allow to live sufficient unto himself. Always there comes that place in our lives when we know that of ourselves we're not sufficient. I shall never forget a few years ago the man who approached me and said that he was past retirement by 5 years, that he had started out as a young man hoping to make $1 million. He said, I don't know how much I'm worth, but I do know I'm worth a lot more than $1 million. And he said, what bothers me is that I'm as unhappy as any man could possibly be. Where did I go wrong? I suggested probably he had gone wrong in that he hadn't asked that question sooner. Where am I going wrong? But I tried to assure that there's that thing in our faith where you can pick up a prodigal after he comes back. And he can make the most of the life that's left. God just won't allow us to go through this life selfishly pawing over this and that and grasping this and that and the other thing and finding happiness from it. It just doesn't come that way. One of our men in seminary was an extremely promising young preacher. He had a good mind. He had the gift of oratory. So much so that he started out in a big church, and now he's in a very small one. And the reason was that he didn't strengthen his virtues. He boasted of the fact that he didn't start his sermon until 6 o'clock Saturday evening. He only read 3 or 4 books in a year. And what could have become one of the finest preachers the church has ever turned out is now pretty much a poor wasted thing whose voice will never reach beyond a very small hearing. Tragic. Oh, we think of being on guard in those places where we're weakest, and we forget that often it's at the strongest point that Satan enters. This place that we begin to take things for granted, where we feel we're strong enough there and we don't have to do anything about it. Look back in the Second World War, in the early years. A German submarine entered where? Scapa Flow. And that German submarine sank the British battleship, the Royal Oak. Now, Britain had defenses up in her weak places where you're afraid the submarines might come in. But Scapa Flow, this is the best fortified harbor we've got. They wouldn't dare come near there. And that's where they entered. And the Royal Oak was sunk. Peter wasn't the only person who neglected his virtues and came to the place where he was asking more of them than they were able to deliver for him. And he took more than his virtues for granted. He knew that Sea of Galilee so well that apparently he had taken it for granted. So often our troubles come in familiar waters where we should have known better. We started our ministry in Buffalo. On Lake Erie, many of our families had summer homes on the Canadian shore of Lake Erie. They knew that water. They knew the undertow. They knew every rock. They knew every hole along that Canadian shore. And yet every summer there was somebody who was drowned, some resident that had been there for years. Just taken for granted. That was just familiar. By and large, you see, Christians don't make their worst showing in unusual circumstances. By and large, they make their worst showing in the familiar place where they should have known better. Consider the home. A recent survey indicates that a large percentage of juvenile delinquents show signs of going wrong when they are under 10 years of age. And if their parents had been alert, they could have done something about those youngsters. The youngsters join gangs to escape social isolation of unhappy homes. And those parents that have a record of unusual accomplishments in the community, great things that they have done in challenging places, and in this familiar place, the home, they have completely neglected it, and their children have gone wrong. Taking it for granted, how important it is to be alert to the dangers of it. I heard a bishop one time get stuck halfway through the Lord's Prayer. And don't smile, it's the easiest thing in the world to do. And I don't even recite the Lord's Prayer without knowing that if I get stuck, I can open my eyes and I know where it is in front of me. We've come to take these things for granted that we think we know so well. And that's where we falter and begin to sink. But when he did get into trouble, Peter knew where to go. He knew what to do about it. That's the important part. Lord, save me. He didn't turn to his friends. He didn't turn to the other disciples. And we're especially reminded of this as we come into the Advent season. There's a song that we occasionally hear sung on television and the radio. It asks some very significant questions. I wish I'd thought of them first as a series of sermons. How many times must the cannonballs fly before they're forever banned? How many years can a mountain exist before it is washed to the sea? How many years must a people exist before they're allowed to be free? How many times must a man turn his head pretending he just doesn't see? How many times must a man look up before he can see the sky? How many years must one man have before he can hear people cry? How many deaths will it take till he knows that too many people have died? The answer, my friend, is blowing in the wind. The answer is blowing in the wind. Well, that's not a satisfactory answer to great questions like that. That in this impersonal universe, amidst all the fate or the luck or whatever you want to call it, that the answer to this is something that's just blown in the wind, and you let it go at that. Peter knew better. Christians know better than that. Boris Pasternak, the great Russian novelist, had collected a number of his letters. Some of them were published. One of them had to do with a widow who had just lost her husband. He wrote how much of him there remains in what he touched and what he named. In the hours of the day, in the flowers and the animals, in the greenness of the woods, in the autumn sky. We lived and did not know the power he wielded among us, the authority that still remains. Fantastic, the authority of Christ that still remains. The hopes and the fears of all the years, they're still met in him, not just blowing in the wind. In him. When I wrote this sermon, I stopped there. I thought that completes it. Peter knew where to turn. That's the great last point. But it isn't. And it just came to me last night. The great last point is that Jesus Christ was there when he was needed. That's the important. More important than whether or not he walked on the sea, more important than what was wrong with Peter, the important fact was that Christ was there when he was needed. And there is no more important fact than that in all of the Gospels. Paul also asked him questions. Shall he ask tribulation or distress or persecution or famine or nakedness or peril or sword? His answer not blown in the wind. In all these things we are more than conquerors through him that loved us. That's the gospel. That's the good news. Lord, save me. And immediately, Jesus stretched forth his hand and caught him. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.
We have presented a recording of this morning's worship service from the Shadyside Presbyterian Church, Amberson Avenue and Westminster Place in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Ministers of the church are the Reverend Dr. Howard C. Scharfe, the Reverend Dr. James R. Spear, and the Reverend J. Wayne Hanratty. Organist and choir director is Russell G. Wickham, and today's sermon by Dr. Scharfe was entitled, Struggling in Deep Waters. Your comments on these services are invited. Address them to the Shadyside Presbyterian Church. Again next Sunday, be listening for another rebroadcast of the regular worship service from the Shadyside Presbyterian Church in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania.